Today, China is almost impossible to imagine without its skyscrapers, high-speed railways, enormous factories, and global ports. Shanghai's Pudong skyline, Shenzhen's technology companies, container ships carrying Chinese goods across the world. China is now one of the world's largest economies. But only a few decades ago, it was a very different country. In the 1970s, China was still overwhelmingly poor. Most people did not live in modern cities. Millions rode bicycles to work. State-owned factories dominated industrial life. In cities, jobs, housing, healthcare, and pensions were tied closely to the state. Why has China's economy experienced such rapid growth? Who changed China's economic system? His name was Rongji, a tough reformer. Rongji was born in 1928 in Changsha, Hunan, during one of the most turbulent periods in modern Chinese history. He came from a family with a scholarly background and grew up at a time when China was struggling with war, poverty, and political instability. Before he was born, his father passed away due to illness. When he was 9 years old, his mother passed away. He grew up and went to school with the help of his uncle. In 1947, he went to Tsinghua University, one of China's most prestigious universities, where he studied electrical engineering. That detail would matter, because Rongji was trained as an engineer, not a politician. He learned to think in terms of systems. Problems had causes, machines had to work, numbers had to add up. And later, as a political leader, he would bring that mindset into the Chinese state. After the communist victory in 1949, Zhu entered the country's economic bureaucracy. He believed in industrial development and the modernization of China. But his career was soon caught in the political storms of the Mao era. During the anti-rightist campaign, he was criticized politically and sent away from the center of power. The Great Leap Forward followed. Then came the Cultural Revolution. For years, Hu's career was disrupted by political campaigns and ideological struggles. He was not simply pushed aside once. He experienced firsthand what happened when political ideology overwhelmed economic reality. And that experience would shape the man he were coming. Rongji emerged from those years with a deeply practical outlook. He was not known for political theory. He was known for numbers, for efficiency, for discipline, and above all, for results. The lesson was simple. Politics could change overnight. Economic reality could not be argued away. After Mao's death, China entered a new era. Deng Xiaoping launched the reform and opening process, and Zhu's career began to recover. He returned to economic management and gradually rose through the bureaucracy. Then came Shanghai. In the late 1980s, Rongji became the mayor of China's largest commercial city. Shanghai was about to become his proving ground. He would soon discover whether the principles he had developed over decades could actually transform a city. And before long, Beijing would ask him to do something much bigger. Not just reforming Shanghai, reforming China. Shanghai was where Rongji first proved that his methods could work. When he became mayor in the late 1980s, the city was one of China's most important industrial centers, but it was also weighed down by aging infrastructure, inefficient state enterprises, and a bureaucracy that moved slowly. Zhu attacked problems directly. He pushed government departments to work more efficiently. He demanded better financial discipline. He accelerated infrastructure development. And then he looked across the Huangpu River, Pudong. At the time, much of Pudong was farmland, warehouses, and industrial land. Zhu saw something different. He saw the possibility of turning Shanghai into a modern international financial and commercial center. The government began pouring investment into infrastructure, roads, bridges, tunnels, utilities, and eventually the skyline of Lujiazui. The transformation would take years, but the direction was unmistakable. Shanghai was being rebuilt for a market economy. For Zhu Rongji, it was more than an urban project. It was proof that an old system could be forced to change. But Shanghai was only the beginning. Zhu was soon called to Beijing. And there, the scale of the problem was completely different. China's economy was growing at extraordinary speed, but growth was becoming unstable. Investment was surging. Banks were lending aggressively. Prices were rising. Local governments were competing to build factories and infrastructure. China was overheating. And Zhu Rongji did something few politicians like to do. He stepped on the brakes. Credit was tightened. Financial discipline was strengthened. Inflation became a central target. The goal was not to stop China's economic transformation. It was to prevent rapid growth from turning into a financial crisis. Zhu's approach was increasingly clear. If the system was out of control, control it. If an institution was inefficient, reform it. And if reform was painful, do it anyway. In 1993, Zhu became China's vice-premier and took responsibility for economic affairs. One of his biggest challenges was something most ordinary people never saw directly: the country's finances. China's rapid economic growth had created a serious imbalance between the central government and local governments. Local governments were responsible for enormous amounts of spending, but the central government did not control enough of the country's tax revenue. Zhu wanted to change that. In 1994, China introduced a major tax-sharing reform. The system was redesigned so that the central government would receive a much larger share of tax revenue. The objective was straightforward: give Beijing the financial power to govern a rapidly changing country. It was one of the most important institutional reforms of the 1990s, and it strengthened the fiscal foundation of the Chinese state. But Zhu's most painful reform was still ahead. For decades, China's state-owned enterprises had been more than businesses. They were social institutions. A factory provided a job. The jobs came with housing, health care, pensions, and a sense of security that could last a lifetime. The system was known as the Iron Rice Bowl. But many state-owned enterprises were losing money. Some survived only because the state continued to support them. Zhu Rongji believed that this could not continue. His logic was brutally simple. A company could not survive simply because the government owned it. So he pushed ahead with restructuring on a massive scale. Factories were merged, others were closed. Ross-making enterprises were forced to confront bankruptcy, and millions of workers were laid off. At the same time, he was pushing reforms in other parts of the state. Banks were being forced to confront enormous bad loans. Government ministries were being reorganized. The old welfare housing system was being replaced by a commercial housing market. The Chinese government itself was becoming leaner and more centralized. Zhu Rongji was not changing one industry. He was rebuilding the machinery of the Chinese state. Then, in 1998, Zhu Rongji became premier of the People's Republic of China. He inherited an economy undergoing one of the most difficult transitions in its modern history. And then the Asian financial crisis hit. China had to defend its economy while continuing reforms at home. For Zhu Rongji, there was no easy choice. China could not simply return to the old system, but it was not yet ready for the full force of global competition either. The question was becoming unavoidable. Could China reform fast enough to compete with the world? Zhu Rongji believed the answer was yes, but it would require his biggest gamble yet. China would have to open itself to the world. By the late 1990s, Zhu Rongji had spent years forcing China to change from within. Now he wanted to do something even more consequential. He wanted to change China's relationship with the outside world. The answer was the World Trade Organization. China had been negotiating membership for years, but joining the WTO meant accepting rules that, would expose China's economy to much greater international competition. Tariffs would have to come down. Markets would have to open. Foreign companies would gain greater access to China. Chinese companies would have to compete under international trade rules. For a country that was still relatively poor, this was a dangerous proposition. China could protect its companies, or it could force them to compete. Rongji chose competition. His logic was simple. If Chinese companies were protected forever, they would never become truly competitive. The gambler paid off. But China's transformation came at a price. The reforms made the economy more efficient. They also broke apart a social system that had provided security to millions of people. The end of the state-owned enterprise system meant the end of the iron rice bowl. Factories closed, workers were laid off, communities built around state enterprises were disrupted. The transition was painful, and the costs were not limited to workers. Rongji's 1994 fiscal reform strengthened the central government by giving Beijing a much larger share of tax revenue. That solved one problem, but it created new pressures for local governments. They still had enormous responsibilities for infrastructure, public services, and economic development. Over time, many local governments increasingly relied on land sales and property development to generate revenue. That helped fuel China's extraordinary real estate boom. It also created vulnerabilities that would become much more visible decades later. And that is the deeper contradiction of Rongji's reforms. He made China more efficient, but also more unequal. He strengthened the state, but weakened some of the old social protections. He opened China to the world, but exposed Chinese society to enormous economic changes. So did Rongji really change China? Yes, but not alone. China's transformation began before him. Deng Xiaoping opened the door. The reforms of the 1980s laid the foundation. Millions of Chinese workers, entrepreneurs, engineers, and officials drove the transformation forward. But Rongji came at a different stage. His task was not simply to open the door. It was to rebuild what was behind it. He strengthened the central government's finances. He forced state-owned enterprises to confront losses. He pushed banks towards a more modern financial system. He helped end the old welfare housing system. He reorganized the government. And he pushed China into the World Trade Organization. In other words, he took reforms into some of the most difficult parts of the Chinese economy. And the results changed the country. Global trade expanded. Manufacturing exploded. Cities grew at extraordinary speed. China came deeply integrated into the world economy. He was the man China called when change could no longer be postponed. And sometimes changing a country means doing what almost nobody wants to do.